It's Damascus Radio. Now stay tuned for the news. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening once again. In our news bulletin for tonight, Russian diplomatic sources announced that Moscow has handed Washington the implementation plan for its initiative concerning placing the Syrian chemical weapons under international supervision, hoping that the plan will be discussed during the upcoming meeting between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry in Geneva. Russian TASS news agency quoted the sources as saying, "We handed the Americans a plan for international supervision on the chemical weapons in Syria, and we hope to discuss the plan in Geneva." Within the same context, U.S. State Department spokesman Jenny Psaki announced that Secretary of State John Kerry will hold talks with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Geneva on Syria, adding that he will meet with the UN envoy to Syria al-Ibrahimi as well. Reuters quoted Psaki as saying in a press conference, "It is expected that Kerry will hold talks in Geneva for 2 days or more." Psaki clarified that the meeting between Kerry and Lavrov is meant to study the ideas proposed by Russia and to assess the accords with the U.S. demands on eliminating the Syrian chemical weapons. Chinese Foreign Minister spokesman Hong Li has meanwhile stressed that his country considers the Russian initiative on chemical weapons in Syria as positive and constructive, and that it could give a push towards finding a solution to the crisis in Syria. Hong told the Russian TASS news agency that Russia's proposal on placing the chemical weapons in Syria under international control will help in easing the tension, expressing hope that all parties can make use of this opportunity. The Chinese official criticized the U.S. threats to launch an aggression on Syria. Malaysia has welcomed the Russian initiative regarding the chemical weapons in Syria, expressing rejection of the U.S. threats of launching an aggression on Syria. Malaysian Bernama news agency quoted Malaysian Foreign Minister Hanifah Aman as saying, "Malaysia welcomes the Russian initiative, expressing conviction that a military intervention should be spared because such a move may cause a horrible destruction and instability in the whole region." Slovakian Foreign Ministry on his part welcomed the Slovakian Foreign Ministry on its part welcomed the Russian initiative, asserting that it will be a positive step in the correct direction, which could ease the tension in the region and prevent the use of chemical weapons in Syria again. In a statement to send as correspondent, Slovak Foreign Ministry spokesman Boris Kandel said, "We are confident that this step could create a positive base to revive the cooperation among the international community, particularly the pivotal role of the Security Council in solving the standing situation in Syria." Russian President Vladimir Putin had earlier stressed that the opposition forces are the ones who use the chemical weapons in Syria and not the Syrian army in order to draw the U.S. to intervene in Syria, asserting that the use of power out of the frame of the UN will be a hostile action. Agence France quoted Putin as saying in an article published by the U.S. New York Times newspaper today that there are reasons to make us believe that the toxic gas was not used by the army but by the forces of the opposition to urge the interference of the foreign powers. The Russian president pointed out that any U.S. military action against Syria will lead to the eruption of a wave of terrorism and the spread of the crisis across the countries or across the borders, adding that the use of force out of the frame of the UN in Syria will constitute a hostile action which leads to the eruption of a new wave of terrorism and destabilizes the Middle East. Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdullahian has meanwhile stressed that his country has documents proving that chemical weapons were used by terrorists in Syria, pointing out that Iran submitted them to the UN. In a statement to the Iranian news agency IRNA, Abdullahian said that Iran informed the UN that 2 cylinders of sarin gas were transported from an Arab country to another one next to Syria, which caused political and security responses. He affirmed that the Syrian government does not need to use chemical weapons, adding that Syria has achieved success in fighting terrorists, so it's not logical to use chemical weapons by the government. On the other hand, member of the National Security and Foreign Affairs Committee in the Iranian Shura Council, Jawad Karimi Qaddousi, has asserted that Syria represents the axis of resistance in the region. Qaddousi stressed that the resistance has prevented the U.S. to continue with its plans, which is considered a big victory for the resistance in the area, pointing out that the reaction of Syria's allied and friendly countries, the U.S. isolation, the development in Egypt and the Saudi deal with Washington, and destabilizing the security of the Zionist entity were behind the decline of the possible U.S. aggression on Syria. It has become quite clear then that the U.S. President Barack Obama has no choice but to accept the Russian initiative on the crisis in Syria, given the growing opposition he is facing. Details are in the following report.
Perhaps it is quite clear that the U.S. President Barack Obama has no choice but to accept the Russian initiative on the crisis in Syria, given the growing opposition he is facing, whether from the Congress or the people themselves, against his plan to launch a military act on Syria. During his recent national speech, Obama was aware that he did not have enough Congress votes for using military power against Syria, as there is a strong anti-war sentiment, as political analysts say, and that this has in itself did its share to influence the Congress, especially that the Pentagon opposes intervention in Syria too. U.S. political analyst Jeff Steinberg has pointed out that the Pentagon had earlier opposed the military action against Syria right from the start, as it perceived the risks in the so-called limited measures in becoming out of control, thus reaching an all-out war. Steinberg added that Obama could not go ahead with the war against Syria without having the Congress consent, unless he is ready to face the risk of dismissal from office. Obama is stuck in a big problem. After the utter failure of the U.S. administration in mobilizing public opinion towards launching an attack against Syria, Obama has agreed on the Russian initiative to place chemical weapons under international inspection, which was widely welcomed internationally and regionally. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had earlier asserted that Russia is working with Syria to prepare a definite applicable plan in the light of the Russian initiative on the chemical weapons, saying that this plan will be implemented in cooperation with the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, the International Organization for the Prohibition of Weapons, and members of the International Security Council.
Meanwhile, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon has called on the Security Council to play an essential role to end what he called the tragedy in Syria, adding that the international community has failed to protect the Syrian people. Western countries have repeatedly curbed political solutions to the crisis in Syria and avoided convening the international conference in Syria and Geneva in line with supporting the armed terrorist groups. The French news agency quoted Ban Ki-moon as saying at a UN meeting on preventing mass atrocities, "Our collective failure to prevent atrocity or crimes in Syria over the past 2.5 years will remain a heavy burden on the standing of the United Nations and its member states." The crackdown on terrorists continue in several areas, with the army units striking hard on the terrorist groups' gatherings and raising their dens, killing many of them and destroying their weapons. A unit of the armed forces eliminated today all members of an armed terrorist group calling itself Al Furat Battalion in Al Sina neighborhood in the city of Deir ez-Zor, according to an official source. Clashes also erupted with an armed terrorist group in Al-Orfi neighborhood and resulted in the death of a number of its members and the injury of others. Meanwhile, a military source told Sana that units of the armed forces tightened their grip over Trad Hill in Al-Shire Mountain in Palmyra and the countryside of Homs after having inflicted heavy losses upon the terrorists in the area. Libyan Foreign Minister Mohammed Abdelaziz has admitted that a lot of Libyans are fighting within the ranks of the armed terrorist groups in Syria. In an interview with RTV channel, the Libyan Foreign Minister said, "This is an undeniable fact. A lot of Libyans have volunteered to fight in Syria." The foreign minister's comments confirm earlier reports and evidence on the influx of weapons and gunmen pouring into Syria from all over the world. Over to Turkey now. Popular protests against the Turkish government policies have renewed in the biggest Turkish cities. Turkish media said that thousands of people demonstrated yesterday in several cities, protesting the killing of a protester last Monday, as Erdogan's Erdogan's police assaulted the protesters using tear gas and water cannons to disperse them. CNN Turk clarified that the police arrested about 20 protesters and others were injured. In Izmir, more than 2,500 people participated in a march challenging the police, which used tear gas on the crowd that shouted, "Justice and Development Party is a murderer." Similar clashes were recorded in Ankara, Mersin, and Antoik and south of Turkey. It is to be noted that these protests came after the killing of the youth Ahmet Atakan last Monday by a hand grenade fired by the Turkish police. And our final item, ladies and gentlemen, U.S. military officials have disclosed that last year witnessed a noticeable rise in sexual assaults or cases of assaults recorded in the U.S. Navy, as 1,100 new cases were reported in the last 12 months. BBC said that the sexual assault cases recorded in the U.S. Navy rose by 50% after a bigger number of the victims started to report their assaults. And that's the end of the news. Thank you for listening.
News and views.
President Bashar al-Assad has underscored in an interview with the Russian Izvestia newspaper that terrorism is not a winning card you play when it suits you and keep it in your pocket when it doesn't. Terrorism is like a scorpion. It can unexpectedly sting you at any time. Therefore, you cannot support terrorism in Syria whilst fighting it in Mali. It is indeed clear for all now that Syria has been waging a fierce war of defense against Al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists of about 83 countries. It is the legitimate war of defense by every true Syrian against more than a third of the world countries which aim at ending the geostrategic pivotal resistant role of Syria. Once these countries fail to subjugate Syria and end its resistant role, they have resorted to terrorist threats of launching strikes against Syrians under the false flag of chemical weapons. Actually, Syria has been for long victim for the threats of Israeli nukes, and not to mention the chemical weapons in the hands of the notorious terrorist groups in Syria. The terrorist cannibals in Syria, as documented and proved, have used their chemical weapons against members of the Syrian Hero Army and civilians in many places of Syria, Khan al-Asal, Aleppo, Jober, and Berze in Damascus countryside, as well as many other documented places. The Syrians, however, are more determined than ever today to stand up against such threats and to pursue their battles against the targeted terrorism aiming at destroying the Syrian state. The Syrians are to stand up to the challenge and the strike at the influx of large documents of Takfiri and Wahhabi terrorists from other countries, estimated in the tens of thousands, and as long as they continue to receive financial and military aid from the puppets Israel, Turkey, EU and US. The ball of terrorism and fire is indeed to burn Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups, initially created in the early 80s by the United States and the West, with Saudi funding to fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and the region in its entirety. Accordingly, the region is in a dire need for peace, stability and security for all. Had the US, Israel and their allies wanted so, the right path is through the proposed Geneva II conference and starting to pressure the countries supporting terrorism in Syria to stop the smuggling of weapons and the streaming of foreign terrorists into the country.
That was News and Views from Damascus Radio.
Newspapers issued in Damascus give high prominence to the heading. Interior Minister Major General Mohammed al-Sha'ar stressed that the conspiracies hatched against Syria through fabricating lies and narratives are aimed at undermining its resistant role, which is the core of every Syrian's pride and dignity. Terrorists in several areas across the country continue to suffer heavy losses as direct strikes are inflicted upon them at the hands of the army units. A military source denied the news broadcast by biased media outlets, claiming that armed terrorist groups control Atman village in Dar'a countryside. Army units made significant progress in pursuing Jabhat al-Nusra terrorists in the town of Ma'lula, proceeding past the town's main square up to St. Tekla convent after eliminating scores of terrorists. A number of Turkish and Syrian youths organized a sit-in in front of the UN Development Programme headquarters in Damascus to show support for Syria in the face of US threats against it. A Russian military source said that the large landing ship Nikolai Filshinkov of the Russian Black Sea Fleet will sail from Novorossiysk city to the Syrian coast. The Russian State Duma called on the U.S. Congress to not allow aggression on Syria, welcoming the Russian initiative for putting the chemical weapons in Syria under international supervision. Russian diplomatic sources announced that Moscow has handed Washington the implementation plan for its initiative concerning placing the Syrian chemical weapons under international supervision, hoping that this plan will be discussed during the upcoming meeting between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry in Geneva. U.S. State Department spokesman Jen Psaki announced that Secretary of State John Kerry will hold talks with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Geneva on Syria, adding that he will meet the UN envoy to Syria Al-Akhdar Ibrahimi as well. The UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon called on the Security Council to play an essential role to end what he called the tragedy in Syria, adding that the international community has failed in protecting the Syrian people. The U.S. threats of launching a military aggression against Syria have sparked a popular rejection worldwide as protests against the U.S. military action seem to be on the rise, drawing popular and youth movements who are taken to the streets to express their outright opposition to U.S. intentions. EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Catherine Ashton called on members of the UN Security Council to assume their responsibilities to resolve the crisis in Syria. In its editorial, Athora writes about Iran's document on chemical weapons as follows. Iranian Deputy Minister for Internal Affairs Hussein Amir Abdullahian stressed that his country has documents proving that chemical weapons were used by terrorists in Syria, pointing out that Iran submitted them to the UN. He affirmed that the Syrian government does not need to use chemical weapons, adding that Syria has achieved success in fighting terrorists. Abdullahian pointed out that Syrian opposition prepared the scenario of chemical weapons based on the red line put by the U.S. President Barack Obama and attempted to accuse the Syrian government, adding that all the U.S. documents cannot prove that the Syrian government is to blame for using chemical weapons. Other titles run as follows. Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei questioned the seriousness of the U.S. latest stance regarding Syria, criticizing Washington's behavior in its relations with the other states. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani stressed that Syria enjoys a special position in the region, being on the front line of the resistance, renewing his country's support to any suggestion at the international level to prevent any aggression on Syria. Cypriot President Nikos Anastasiades welcomed the Russian initiative on placing the chemical weapons in Syria under international supervision.
Hello and welcome. An official source at Dar'a Antiquities Department said that 11 historic towns and sites in the city came under attack and sabotage by the armed terrorist groups, causing huge damages to their layers. The majority of regions which were subject to acts of secret excavations, sabotage and looting are in Dar'a western countryside, where the armed terrorist groups are active, the source said. It added that those regions are well known for their historic richness, as they are considered one of the most ancient sites in the world, where they have witnessed the succession of a number of civilizations.
You are still tuned to the broadcasting service of the Syrian Arab Republic, Damascus Radio. Before signing off with the Syrian national anthem, here's another look at the news summary. Russian diplomatic sources announced that Moscow has handed Washington the implementation plan for its initiative of placing the Syrian chemical weapons under the international supervision. U.S. State Department spokesman has meanwhile announced that U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is due to hold talks with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Geneva over the chemical weapons issue in the presence of the UN envoy Lakhdar Ibrahimi. The Russian initiative receives worldwide welcome and appreciation as the Chinese, the Malaysian and the Slovak foreign ministries, laud the initiative, describing it as a positive step on the right direction. Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Hussein Amir Abdullahian stresses that his country has documents proving that chemical weapons were used by the terrorists in Syria and that those documents are now with the UN. Units of the Syrian Arab Army keep on cracking down on terrorists in several areas, striking hard on their gatherings and killing many of them in Deir ez-Zor and Homs, as the Libyan foreign minister admits that many Libyans are fighting along the terrorist gangs in Syria. And popular protests against the government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan continue in many Turkish cities, as reports speak of clashes erupting between the protesters and the Turkish police in Ankara, Mersin and Ayçiçek. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of our English transmission for tonight. You are welcome to join us again tomorrow at the same time on the same frequencies. Until then, this is Damascus Radio with all the staff members wishing you all the best and a very good night.